Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Well, thank you for coming. I'd like to thank the Institute in particular for allowing me to visit. I regard it as an honour, I still regard myself as a novice mathematician, statistician, even though I love the subject. This is going to be a two-part presentation. I'm going to lead with some background material on some of the challenges we're already seeing in Australia in terms of climate change. So this is observed climate change that's taking place now, not what we think might happen in decades ahead. And some of the research opportunities that are available, but also the issue of uncertainty, and this is certainly where Richard will make some quite good statements, I think, about where our research is heading. So by background, what I should point out, as you may know, Australia is the driest inhabited continent in the world. We also have a very variable climate, and part of that is weather extremes, and we're renowned as being a nation of droughts and floods, basically. And we've seen evidence of that in the southeast corner of the country. We had a 10-year drought that's just been broken by one event about a month ago. Climate change is evident across southern Australia, and I'll show you what's happening in the southwest of the country. Over here where I live, we're still in the throes of hydrological drought, but it does seem to be getting worse, and that drought's been around since the mid-1970s. What we have seen across southern Australia is that water resources and also marine and terrestrial ecosystems are suffering. With the marine ecosystems, it's a case that there's a warm current that goes down the east coast of the country down here, and that current is now bringing temperate waters down in Tasmania, and people are actually seeing the ecosystems, or the members of ecosystems, actually changing. So we're seeing, for example, fish around Tasmania that have never been recorded before that belong up in warmer waters. And we're also even seeing tropical species moving further down the coast. What we're also seeing, and I'll show a movie just before Richard's presentation, there are some agricultural areas in the country where farmers are already going broke, and I think given the season that has transpired, that there will be more. In terms of climate change, there's various estimates of what it will mean for Australia, but usually the news is bad, that there will be a reduction in our gross domestic product. If we just look at temperature, and here I'm just looking at the southwest of Western Australia again, this is a minimum temperature series and a maximum temperature series. And what you see with both of these, they've been centred on a period from 1961 to 1990. And what you see in the early part of the record are low minimum temperatures and lowish maximum temperatures. But what you see towards the end of the record is a concentration of higher minima and higher maxima. Even though we've seen in the past with maximum temperature, there have been years that have experienced quite high temperatures, but what we're really seeing now is it's year after year after year, there are higher temperatures than what you might expect. If we look at these is an inflow series into the dams that supply the city of Perth in southwest WA. I live north of the CBD. And if you look at this time series here, this is inflows over the water year. And you can see early in the record up until about 1975, there has been some really wet winters where you had large inflows into the dams. But since about 1975, we've never seen those winters again. And if you look carefully at this time series here, you can see since about the mid-1990s that there's been a decline. This plot over here is just this series log transformed with a non-parametric regression model put through it. And you can see at the latter part of the record this decline. And this only goes to 2007. If you look at our winter, which we've now been through, the inflow would be down around here for our winter. It's been a very dry year. There's only about, in terms of inflows and summer water demand, the inflow is only about 10 days of summer water demand. So it's been a very severe winter. If we try to look at the physical reasons as to what's going on, this is one of the best pieces of work I could show you. This is looking at the global circulation, but concentrating on what's known as Phillips instability criterion. So this is something that atmospheric dynamicists use to actually characterise how stable the atmosphere is. And it's a measure of the propensity for the generation of storms. So the more stable the atmosphere, the less likely you are to generate a storm. And you can see when you look at this mid-latitude band in the southern hemisphere, and you look at where the reduction in the instability has taken place, it's largely centred over southwest Western Australia. But you can see this goes right across southern Australia. And if you really want to get into what's causing this change in instability, it certainly changes in the temperature gradient from north to south, but also the jet stream has experienced a fairly sizable reduction in its velocity. Now I'll move on to general circulation models, and this is leading to Richard's presentation. When I came into climate science mainly through climate impact assessment, and one of the problems we've always faced is, at least with the fourth assessment report of the IPCC, is the order of 23 different climate models. If you try to use all 23, you end up with wide bands of uncertainty on any variable you care to name. And there's always a question of, do we need to use all 23? Can we weight them, rank them, or even reject some? And part of the problem we've seen, at least, is shown here. This is only a subset of these models, and the only reason why these models have been chosen is that they're common to a number of different studies. Going back a few years ago now, this particular study was looking at how realistic the simulation of the El Nino Southern Oscillation is, and you can see with these three models they do well, and for these other models they do not. Then these two groups independently did an assessment basically on the continental scale, the Australian mainland, looking at different aspects. This one concentrated on daily probability density functions for maximum minimum temperature and rainfall. This one was looking mainly at things like correlations and root mean squares for those variables, as well as sea level pressure. And what you find is that apart from this one model, which is a bit embarrassing seeing it's my home organisation, these two assessments are almost in full agreement with each other. When we move down to the Murray-Darling Basin, this is a very huge river basin in Australia. What you see is, and again this is repeating the same metrics that were used here but at the basin scale, and what you see here is that this group of models that supposedly perform well at the continental scale do not perform well at the basin scale, and when you go down to the basin scale for these models they perform better than the other. So you've got basically a direct contradiction between the two. And that has all sorts of ramifications for impact assessments. If we go to a smaller scale, and this is only looking at one variable, one output from the global climate models, this is looking at the seasonal cycle of mean sea level pressure, which is quite important for southern Australia. And what you see here is very little agreement, even with this study, and certainly with the others. So when you're doing these sort of simplistic assessments of how well GCMs perform, you find some really hard lessons, I think. And when you start looking at how well they perform at large scales, that doesn't necessarily give you an idea of how well they're going to perform even at very large basin scales. Now when you're coming to impact assessment, some people disagree with this, but my feeling is if you can't believe that a GCM can simulate the present climate, why should you necessarily believe that it will be able to simulate the future? Now, I've had some arguments with climate scientists about this. But in saying that, we also have to recognise that just because the model performs well for present day climates doesn't necessarily mean it will perform well for future climates. And what you can see, even if you looked at those individual studies where you had models that supposedly perform well, when you start putting IPCC emission scenarios through them for decades ahead, the model results actually diverge. So they might perform reasonably well for the present, but you get a divergence in the predictions when you look to the future. If we look, this is again for background, we look at for winter and summer various emission scenarios going from mild to severe. As you might expect, you do see temperatures rising, and in particular in the inland regions of the country, which, as you probably know, are hot enough as it is. But when you come to rainfall predictions, there's quite an amount of detail here. What you see, these percentiles are basically just percentiles of models. So if you're looking at the rainfall that comes out of each GCM, you sort it and you just pick the percentiles out of that. And you can see even with low emission scenarios, the changes are afoot, but as you start going into these higher emission scenarios, you can see changes taking place right across the country. But what you also see with is quite different changes when you start looking across the seasons, but you have to recognise that Northern Australia has high rainfall, well, it's mainly summer rainfall dominated, and Southern Australia is mainly winter dominated rainfall. One of the things that Richard and his colleague Nadia Leith have been looking at is trying to assess model uncertainty in terms of variables that are used in statistical downscaling schemes, and these are just some of the different techniques that are available for downscaling, going from empirical methods, very ad hoc methods, through the more sophisticated statistical methods, and down to dynamical. What we typically find in Australia is with the dynamical models seem to now get the seasonal structure of rainfall correct, but we're still seeing the GCM drizzle propagating in through a regional climate model, so you end up with far more wet days than you actually observe and lower rainfall intensities that you actually see. In many cases, the difference in intensity is of the order of a factor of 2 or 3, and as an engineering hydrologist, that's just disastrous in terms of doing a water budget, particularly in a country as dry as Australia. One model we've been using now for quite some time is a non-homogeneous hidden Markov model, originally developed at the University of Washington. And with that particular model, there is an observed process which looks at the sequence of regional precipitation occurrence patterns across the region of interest, so it's a multi-site model. But underpinning this is a hidden discrete valued process, which is a sequence of weather types or weather states. And one of the beauties of this model is when you start looking at the state-to-state transitions, it's driven by atmospheric information, or what we call atmospheric predictors. So that you do, when you're looking at transition probabilities from one weather state to another, they are dependent on the condition of the atmosphere, and that's where you can actually use the model using reanalysis data to look at changes in synoptic types in the historical record, or you can actually use the model for climate change assessments. The model we've mainly used looks at May to October, or here we're concentrating on Western Australia again, and this is what we call our winter half year, and something like 69 to 80% of rainfall over the southwest falls in that period. Work we do with the reanalysis data set, we use the NSET NCAR reanalysis, and we only use it from 1958 on. There are data from 1948 to 1958, but those data are based on very few observations in the southern hemisphere, and people in our Bureau of Meteorology have found in the past that early part of the reanalysis record is not very reliable. When we go to fit this model, we do sequential information. We start with some professional judgments from meteorologists as to what key atmospheric predictors should be. And we also use the Bayes information criterion. And what we've typically found is that this seems to work quite well. You do end up with, when you get the minimum BIC value and you do some diagnostics, you see weather types that do reflect reality, and there doesn't appear to be any redundancy. But once you, for this particular period, once you start going beyond about 6 weather states, you do see weather states coming through that are quite similar to each other, but they have higher BIC values anyway. For this particular season, the variables that have come out, this is across a number of grid cells in the reanalysis data set. So there's an average across the region of the mean sea level pressure. North-south mean sea level pressure gradient. This gives you an idea of the strength of the westerly winds, and it turns out that can be a reasonably important variable because it actually controls how much moisture is being advected off the ocean into the hinterland. Another one which is quite important in terms of the greenhouse signal is a measure of atmospheric moisture at the 850 hectopascal level, so it's about 1.5 kilometres in the standard atmosphere. And this is the difference of the air temperature at that level minus the dew point at that level. So positive values actually reflect low atmospheric moisture. And there was another variable we were looking at which we used to remove some systematic bias in the downscaling model intra-seasonally, but it has no impact really up beyond that. I should point out this model has been subjected to a number of split sample tests where we fitted it to a dry epoch in the record and then tested it in the wet and vice versa, and it seems to work quite well. And as I mentioned before, because you can actually compare the weather states that come out of the model to what people actually observe, it's been subjected to a fair amount of physical scrutiny as well. And this is just a quick idea of how well this model does perform, reflecting the validation period and the fitting period, looking at how well the model simulates daily rainfall amounts and the frequency characteristics of wet and dry spells. So it does do a very good job. And this model, in fact, has been used in a number of locations, not just southwest Western Australia. It's been used in northeastern Queensland in the tropics, in the Murray-Darling Basin and southern South Australia. Now this is, I'm in what's called a flagship within CSIRO, so we tend to be more output driven rather than technology driven. So we have to be very sensitive to our stakeholders and users of the information we generate. And I think if you went through most of the impact literature around the world, what you typically see, people will use some sort of subset of GCMs, sometimes an explanation as to why they've only used that subset, usually not. And they'll use a number of emission scenarios, calculate a change in some variable. This could be annual runoff, for example. And particularly in areas north of, if you know Australian geography, certainly north of Sydney, what you typically find is you start getting changes that are quite large, that cover both sides of the origin. And what people often do is take a best guess, which is basically just the median, which is near zero. And the sort of response you tend to get from people who supposedly can use this information is shown here, and quite rightfully so. And I think the question that's being begged is, given this sort of thing, is there a more sensible way of doing these impact assessments and coming up with better estimates of uncertainty than something like this? And that's the subject that Richard will talk about. What I'll do now though, just before Richard gets up, is attempt to show a movie of what's happening in Western Australia. This is looking at this is changes in the probability of rainfall in May, June and July. And you can see here we've got a number of sites. This is work that Richard, one of his students, has done. Number of sites where we have rainfall data, and these are contours of the probability of wet days each year in that May, June, July period. And what you see when you keep looking at this is you can see here in the early part of the record going from the 1940s and the 1960s, it actually gets wetter in the region. You can see the contours moving into the hinterland. As you hit about post 1960, you'll see those contours actually retreat. And you'll notice towards the end here a very sudden drying in this particular region. And what you also see is severe drying up here in the latter part of the record as well, and this is certainly a region where wheat farming is really under stress at the moment. So I'll stop there and hand it over to Richard.
Actually, may I ask a question, please?
Yes?
I noticed that that wet in the early part, was that commensurate with this, what sometimes people call a spurious drop after the 40s? I mean, there's some question as to whether or not that drop in the global temperatures is actually spurious or whether it's real, because you do see it over land.
Yeah, well, this is only using recorded rainfall, so it should be independent of any spurious.
Exactly.
Yes.
So the point is this evidence that bump, if you were to look regionally, is this bump real?
Oh, well, I think, it is because it's based on data, but it's, I mean, even when you look at that dam inflow series that I showed you, that period in the late 60s was very wet. And it was the last time we actually had a flood go through the Swan River in Western Australia. So it's been over 40 years since Perth has seen a flood. So I think what we're seeing in that particular animation is quite real. I know what you're talking about, but I think what we're seeing here is quite real. As I said, it's based on station data. The data itself's been rigorously assessed by Richard, who has had many years of experience with daily rain gauge information and all the ins and outs of observer practices and how that corrupts the record, and all of that sort of been taken into account here. So I'm quite confident that what you're seeing here is a reflection of the data.
I agree. And there are those of us who are not completely convinced that flow rate was an artifact.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
I don't know if you want to ask other questions to Bryson before we get technical. Or whether you want to save it to the end. We're getting technical. Can I have the microphone?
Yep.
Okay, so thank you again for coming. And thanks to Bryson for setting the scene. Well, as he's indicated, there are real challenges to do with what's happened with the climate in Australia and what might happen in the future. And I'm really going to talk about, I'm going to use the precipitation decline in southwest WA as a sort of motivating case study for the development of a framework for handling uncertainty associated with your choice of climate simulator. I'm in the process of migrating my vocabulary to the Goldstein-Rougier framework, so but I'm in a sort of limbo state at the moment, so it may get a bit confused. But so I mean, this basically summarises what Bryson has said. So I'm going to look at a case study involving precipitation projections for southwest Western Australia for the first half of the winter, May, June and July, which is the main period of rainfall decline. Now Bryson has already summarised the non-homogeneous hidden Markov model, but we're using a slightly simplified version of that here, which has only 3 atmospheric drivers, which are the daily mean sea level pressure, the north-south pressure gradient, and this dew point temperature depression. What's shown here, this is a map of the southwest of Western Australia, and this statistical downscaling model is going to produce, based on the large-scale atmospheric structure rainfall, daily rainfall time series at each of these blue locations, and there are 31 of them.
Richard, is the grid on your picture indicative of the...
It is, yes, that is actually the NSEP grid. Is it the NSEP grid or is it the GCM grid? Because everything was, it's the grid on which all of the atmospheric predictors were used. So basically there are 9 grid squares here, so the mean sea level pressure is an average over those 9 squares, etc. Yeah.
Rainfall is spatially correlated.
Yes. And in this model, the spatial correlation of the rainfall arises from the weather states. So there are some states where everything is wet. The probability of rainfall everywhere is very high, right? So once you know which state you're in, basically all the sites tend to move together, or to be wet or dry in particular spatial patterns. Yeah. So so the model's been calibrated, as Bryson. I mean, this particular downscaling model is extensively used in Australia, and there's a lot. These guys have a lot of experience with it, and it's pretty robust. 6 GCMs being used in this particular study, and the choice of those GCMs is based on studies such as Bryson put up in his table, sort of identifying which of the GCMs might be suitable for impact studies in this particular region. Okay, don't need to worry about that. Now, I think most of us are aware that the choice of climate simulator, and in particular the choice of GCM in a climate impact study, represents a significant source of uncertainty in the future projections. And as Bryson concluded, it's useful to have a probabilistic assessment of uncertainty. And there's been quite a lot of interest in this kind of thing over the last 5 years in particular. Modelling centres are starting to claim that they're producing PDFs that are useful for people. Now the simplest approach to doing that is simply to throw all of the GCM information into a big pot and treat that as a probability distribution, which is simple and easily interpretable, and maybe that's why it's the first thing that people did. But there are many problems with that. I'm only going to talk about one of them, which is that it underestimates the true uncertainty, because if in this particular example we've only got 6 GCMs that have been regarded as acceptable for climate impact studies in this part of Australia, and to produce a probability distribution out of 6 observations, I mean, you could imagine that if you were able to invest more resources and develop more credible climate simulators, then the range would expand. Okay. So
GCM's independent.
then, well, that's another issue. Yeah, I mean, you know, there's a can of worms here which I am going to open. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, there's all that stuff as well. Now, so I'm going to describe briefly an alternative approach that I developed initially working with a PhD student, Nadia Leith, and John T was her external examiner, where we sat down and sort of thought about, well, what do climate simulators actually try to do when we use them for projections? And what we thought was, well, what they try to, I mean, when you get a future climate projection from a GCM or any other climate simulator, it is not intended to be a prediction of the actual climate. It's intended to be a plausible sequence with climate-like properties. Okay? And our interpretation of that is that projections from climate simulators aim to reproduce the statistical properties that we might expect over long periods of time in the future. So our view is that if you were to take some output from climate models in the future, or not climate models in the future, future projections from climate simulators, different climate simulators, if you found that the time series from one simulator was well represented by a first order autoregression, then you'd expect that the time series of the same variable for the other simulators would also be well described by a first order autoregression, because the simulators are all attempting to represent the same dynamical system. Right? But you wouldn't necessarily expect that the parameters in the autoregression would be the same because of differences in the way the simulators are constructed. Okay? So what we say is that the outputs from the different simulators should have a similar statistical structure and hence can be described using the same form of statistical model, but the parameters in that statistical model will differ between simulators. And so what we try to do is to establish a distribution for these statistical parameters, these descriptors of the simulator outputs, that describes what I like to think of as some population of potential climate simulators, but which Jonty would describe as an infinite exchangeable set. And I actually don't, I mean, operationally, I don't think there is much difference between, yeah, right. And I mean, we've got a paper in Applied Statistics earlier this year that that sets this out. In case it helps, here's a schematic of the idea. So this was produced before I was introduced to the state-of-the-art vocabulary. So it still says GCM up there instead of climate simulator. I mean, I think it's really, I think the vocabulary is really helpful actually. Rather than talking about models all the time, which gets very confusing. So a climate simulator, as far as I'm concerned, is a black box, unless it hasn't been invented yet, in which case it's a pale blue box. Right? So what we get out of one of these things is a time series, say. Right? Now, so we've got 5 climate simulators up here, all of which are producing time series of some variable. And all of these time series are characterized by, for example, I mean, this one you might characterize it in terms of a trend, a linear trend, and there's some oscillation going on there with some amplitude and some frequency. Right? All of them have got that. I mean, this one hasn't really got any oscillation. That's the same as having 0 oscillation. Right? So the amplitude of the oscillation there is 0. The slope of the trend here is 0. Okay? But we've got there's some kind of, we could describe all of these things using a statistical model that says trend plus oscillation plus irregular component. And therefore we could characterize them with the trend slope, one number, the amplitude of the oscillation, and maybe some residual variance or something. Okay, so all of these time series can be characterized in terms of 3 or 4 numbers, which are parameters. This hasn't come out very well. I'll call them theta in a statistical descriptor of the time series. These thetas then are considered to be drawn from some underlying distribution. Okay? And it is this distribution that Nadia and I claim characterizes climate simulator uncertainty.
Excuse me, and clearly you have different distributions for each type of parameter.
It's a joint distribution.
It's a joint distribution.
Yeah.
Are they correlated?
Potentially. Yes. Yeah. This is a mathematical talk, so I'm being, everything's totally general, right? Okay, so right, so, yeah, okay, I've already said all that. I think so. Some vocabulary. I'm going to borrow some more terminology from other people who are better qualified than I am. The statistical models that I'm going to use to describe these time series I'm going to call emulators. Okay? They're not emulators in the same sense of the sort of Gaussian process type emulators that Jonty uses, but they are emulators in the sense that they attempt to mimic the outputs of these deterministic models. Okay. So, the structure then is hierarchical. Hierarchical in the sense that there is a hierarchy of levels of randomness here. So, the simulator outputs, which we've got a vector of observations y from the ith climate simulator here, are drawn from distributions with parameters theta I, and the thetas themselves are drawn from this underlying distribution with some parameter big theta. So there's two levels of randomness, which is why we call it hierarchical. If then, to go back to the water resources problem, I want to generate future scenarios of precipitation in the region, what I can do is I can start by taking this distribution, I can sample a theta, a little theta, from this distribution, and then I can use the statistical emulator to generate a corresponding sequence of, if you like, pseudo climate simulator data. Which turns out to be fairly straightforward, in fact. The calibration of this type of statistical model, as many of you know, is not trivial, but is most easily done in a Bayesian framework using MCMC methods, and we need to do things like think about prior distributions for the parameters in the model. To put that in the context of the Australian water resources, we're using this statistical downscaling scheme to get from the GCM level down to the local precipitation. And in order to do that, I need to get three input series: mean sea level pressure, north-south pressure gradient, and the dew point temperature depression. And these are daily time series. Okay? And so we've got fairly simple, this is the kind of form, basically I fit a joint trivariate time series model to each of these, to these series. So, for example, the mean sea level pressure, the marginal time series structure for that is essentially a first order autoregression, but the variance actually has some seasonality in it. Okay. But these are fairly simple statistical descriptors of what the outputs look like. So there are 5 parameters here. That one, that one, that one, that one, and that one. So to describe mean sea level pressure on its own, I've reduced an entire time series to 5 parameters. And that's well, it isn't actually the theta I'm going to work with, but I'm going to call that parameter vector psi. Okay. And that's estimated separately using maximum likelihood for every data source and each time period, the 20th century and the future simulations. My theta, okay, is going to be the change in this parameter vector between the A2 21st century simulations and the 20th century, okay, for the same data source. So if I wanted then to emulate a particular climate simulator, I could say, well, the parameters I use for the future would be the 20th century parameters plus the theta. Okay. However, because the GCMs actually produce the estimates of these parameters that I get from the 20th century for the GCMs are not the same as those I get from the NSEP data, and so in some cases are very different. An alternative way, maybe a more sensible way, which I'm going to call adjusted emulation, is to add the change back to the NSEP parameter estimates. Okay? And that corrects for the bias in the GCMs in terms of all of these properties, not just bias in the mean. It corrects for bias in the autocorrelation structure, in the variance, in the seasonality, etc. Okay, so here are some plots just showing the distribution of mean sea level pressure, pressure gradient, dew point temperature depression. The blue ones are for the 20th century, the red ones are for the future simulations. So for example, this box plot here shows the distribution of NSET, mean sea level pressure, in the 20th century. This shows the distribution of emulated NSET sea level pressure. And this shows the distribution from the CSIRO GCM 20th century run. Okay, now they're all pretty similar. This one, which is the pressure gradient, you can see that the GCM has less variation than either the observation, well, the NSET, the reanalysis, or the emulated reanalysis. And therefore, when we get into the future, here's the GCM, here's the emulated GCM, and here's the emulation after adjustment to sort of correct with the bias. And you can see that this is the adjusted emulation has more variability, and that takes into account the fact that we know that this GCM underestimates variability. So that will do with that. Now, if we want to put all this into this hierarchical framework, what I'm going to do as a computational shortcut is I'm going to replace the data from each data source with the maximum likelihood estimator of the statistical parameters. And the reason for doing that is partly because I'm reducing a time series with 30,000 observations into 5 numbers. But also, it's a standard result in statistics that maximum likelihood estimators are asymptotically sufficient statistics, which basically means that once you have the MLE, there is no other information in the data about the parameters you're interested in. So I'm not actually losing any information by doing that. Another nice thing about this is that in large samples, and we have large samples here, MLEs have approximate normal distributions. Okay? So I can take the distribution of theta hat I as multivariate normal. In the absence of any better ideas, we're going to take the individual thetas, the sort of underlying descriptors for each climate simulator, themselves to have a normal distribution. Although, if I wanted to accommodate the idea that some climate simulators are sort of outliers, but I don't really want to discount them, I might choose to do something like a multivariate T distribution, which has heavy tails and therefore allows things to be some way from the centre of the distribution. And then I need to think about judgments about essentially where this population of climate models sits. I'm not really, and they can be done by thinking about the physical limits of the climate system. So, if I want to sample future rainfall scenarios incorporating all this uncertainty, basically what I have to do is to generate my posterior predictive distribution of the statistical descriptors, use the emulator to generate time series of the atmospheric drivers, and then just downscale those to daily precipitation. And I'm going to get 100 daily precipitation sequences, each driven by a different pseudo GCM. If you do that, well, this plot shows projections that we get for seasonal rainfall totals for the period averaged over the period 2046 to 2065. So it's mid-21st century under the A2 scenario. This is a box plot showing the distribution of seasonal rainfall totals in the 20th century, according to the NSET reanalysis, the downscaled NSET reanalysis. My battery's running out. But, that was a cheap pen from a conference. I thought I should use it for something. Right, the red box plots are the results of downscaling the projections from the individual climate simulators individually. Okay, you can see there's quite a lot of discrepancy between those. They all suggest future drying because they're all lower than the 20th century. The orange one here is what you get if you just pool all of those. So you just throw all your climate simulators into a bucket. Right? And this is the result of the framework I've just been describing, which gives you slightly wider ranges of uncertainty, and in particular shows that a near zero rainfall winter is not out of the question. As Bryson said, I don't think you've had a near zero rainfall winter already, actually. But politically, that's quite a helpful result for Bryson when he's trying to engage with his stakeholders. But maybe you can talk about that. Do you want to comment on that at all?
Oh, I think it highlighted the fact that the sort of winter we experienced, where the rainfall wasn't zero, but was low enough, basically not to generate any rainfall, is a reality. And I think what this is showing is that in the future it's likely to occur again.
Yeah. We should say that this was produced before the current winter.
What's available water capacity?
Excuse me, could I see your caveat again?
Can you run scroll without?
Thank you, your head was right.
Sorry.
Richard, can I just ask about your top picture? The distributions aren't very skewed. Perhaps they're not as skewed as I would have expected.
This is because they're seasonal rainfall totals. So the season is 92 days. So yeah.
So is it right that possibility of a dry winter, because you know that those 6 red ones are a bit biased wet, or at least dryest is biased wet.
It's not necessarily that it knows that they're biased. I mean, it's taking into it takes that into account, certainly. Yes, but it also takes into account that there are only 6 of them.
Yes.
And it's sort of saying these are 6 from some wider pool of potential climate simulators. So if we were able to have infinite resources to keep on building climate simulators, we'd expect the range from here.
Yeah, that's fair. Where did that come into your model?
This is because the climate simulator. Let me think. Is there an easy way of getting back here? Easy, but not necessarily quick. This is because the climate simulators are depicted here as being drawn from this distribution. Yes. And what I'm trying to do is to use these 6 observations I've got down here to learn something about that entire distribution. And then I'm simulating from the distribution that I've learned about. Yeah.
If your framework, Richard, is able to correct for differences between simulators, wouldn't it be advantageous to put all the simulators in rather than screen out the ones that you thought weren't very good?
It probably would, and at the time when we did this work, I hadn't done this part, which is what I did last week, because I thought Newton Institute ought to do some mathematics and ought to really try and understand what the hell this is doing, right? So, and again, borrowing ideas from your own paper, which, as you know, I've thought about very carefully. So I thought it would be worth thinking about what this framework that I've described actually does. So that's one of the things I wanted to do during my visit here. John G. and Michael's paper that's on the wiki for the Exeter workshop has a very nice diagram in it, which is a directed acyclic graph that shows the relationships between the various components of their approach to climate simulators. I'm not quite sure I agree with yours, but this is mine anyway. And what this shows is all the quantities that we're considering in the framework I've just described to you. So I've got nature over here, separated by climate simulators over here, and there are M climate simulators. So this box represents, there are M of these boxes. So I've got some data from nature, or the NSET reanalysis at any rate, which I've reduced to theta hat 0, and I've got the corresponding estimates for all the climate simulators. The data are dependent upon some underlying true parameter, okay, that summarises the state of nature, theta 0. Similarly for the climate simulators, these arrows are causal. That means if I go and change the description of nature, if I'm God or something like that, then I can go and sort of say, okay, the Earth's mean temperature is now going to be 35 degrees. Okay, so that corresponds to changing theta 0. In that case, I'd expect that that intervention will lead to changes in what I observe. Right? It will also lead to changes in what the climate simulators produce, because the modelling groups are going to go and recalibrate their simulators. Right? So that's why that arrow is there. Now, climate simulators are not perfect. So, what you get, the description that you get from the climate simulator depends not only on the state of nature, but also on some, if you like, bias terms arising from the approximations, etc., made in the modelling groups. And the bias terms, and this gets back to your earlier question, are not in any way independent, or they're not nice at all. And so I described that's why it says here lies the root of all evil, because this is what makes climate simulation and multi-model ensembles difficult. Another nice thing about this type of graph is it shows conditional independence relationships, which makes it possible to factorise the posterior distribution for anything you're interested in a rather elegant way. So I would argue that what we want to do is to use the data from the actual climate and the climate simulators to learn about theta 0. Theta 0 is the only thing we care about. It's the summary of the actual climate. So if I'm going to be Bayesian about it, I want the posterior distribution, which is the probability of the density of theta 0 given all of the data. And I can then use the directed acyclic graph to basically just manipulate this probability, and it turns out it factorises. I'm not going to go into the details because we're running out of time. It factorises into 3 contributions. There is a prior on theta 0. There is a likelihood for the climate observations given theta 0, and there is a likelihood for the climate model, the climate simulator outputs. And it factorizes that directed acyclic graph allows us to see that factorization, which is really, really nice. So basically, we can write the posterior here as a prior times the likelihood for the simulator outputs times the likelihood for the observations.
And the likelihood for the simulator outputs is an integrated likelihood.
It is, but I'm going to be rather simplistic here. I'm actually going to try and solve this analytically for a simple but not completely stupid example. So the general result is that this is what the posterior looks like. So, and here's another jaunty phrase. I need to make some judgments about how to represent these things, and to start thinking about it, I'm just going to consider that everything is Gaussian. Right? So the actual climate has a multivariate normal distribution centred on true climate and with some covariance matrix. That's completely uncontroversial because I'm using, this is the maximum likelihood estimator, and that is generally true if I've got large data sets. Similarly, the individual climate model, climate simulator outputs have got multivariate normal distributions. The covariance matrix there is different from that in the actual climate, but at the moment they're sharing a common covariance matrix. The theta I here, the climate simulator description, is actual climate plus a bias term, and the bias term is multivariate normal centered on this thing, right? This thing itself is the center of the climate simulator population. Okay, this really is the root of all evil. And I need to make some judgments about that. And I'm going to say that I don't know where the root of all evil is, but it's probably some way from the, it's centered on 0 and it's got some covariance matrix. So this is basically going to tell me about the discrepancy of the whole collection of climate simulators from actual climate. Okay.
Excuse me, your reanalyses that you're using, are any of your climate simulators involved in the generation of those reanalyses?
Not the ones we're using here.
The other thing I wanted to ask you was, have you considered using different reanalyses to estimate your phase yield? If you were to, say, use 20th century reanalyses as opposed to NSEP reanalyses, I mean,
Yeah, I think in various case studies that I've worked on, we have, for example, compared like NSEP and the ERA 40.
in the ERA 40, yes.
And yeah, I mean, it's something that certainly needs to be done with care. I haven't encountered an example yet where the results of using different reanalyses have been staggeringly different.
No, I wouldn't expect them to, but it would simply be just much more comfortable.
Right, yeah. At the moment, I'm not worrying about practical matters like that. This is a sort of theoretical framework, really. Okay, and
when people bring up practical issues, that means that they've already accepted that this is the way to go.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Now, what's rather nice about this is that if we do this, we can actually find an explicit analytical representation for the posterior. Now, the statisticians in the room ought to know what that is, and I ought to have known what it is before I did it, but knowing what it is and being able to prove that it is so are two different things. And I think, actually, given that the time is getting on, I'm going to skip my beautiful matrix inverse result, which Jonty appreciates, about inverting a matrix which is a Kronecker product. I feel like a real mathematician now because I've used a Kronecker product for real. But if you work through all this, you discover that the posterior for theta 0 is in fact multivariate normal. The mean vector has this form, which looks fairly nasty, but it is a weighted sum of the prior mean, the parameters, the information from the climate observations, and the information from the climate simulators. That's what all the statisticians would have expected. The weights are the inverses of the relevant variance matrices. The difficult thing in the proof is to show that this is in fact the variance matrix of the corresponding to the climate simulator information.
So basically it's like a Kalman filter.
Well, yeah, I mean a Kalman filter does conditional, yeah, I mean it's conditioning, yes. But getting to this bit is not trivial, actually.
No, I wasn't poo-pooing it. No,
Yes. I mean,
It is a Kalman filter because you've not used the properties of the normal distribution beyond the mean and variance structure.
Right.
I completed the quadratic form.
Yeah.
Now, that actually sheds an awful lot of light on what's going on, because we can think, what happens if we increase the number of climate observations? If we increase the number of climate observations, typically what will happen is that theta hat 0 will tend to theta 0. Okay? So J0 will tend to 0. This is the covariance matrix of theta hat 0. This will tend to 0, and all the weight will be concentrated on the observations, which makes perfect sense. Right? If I want to understand about the real climate, the best thing I can do is to get more and more observations on the real climate. What happens if I increase the number of climate simulators? So this is something that is a bit of a bugbear for some of the methods that are in current use. let's say increase n, the number of climate simulators. This thing, no, let me think what happens. I did figure out what happened, and I can't remember what it is.
Tends to be
It tends to big lambda, that's right, which is the covariance matrix of the skull thing, which basically means you cannot reduce your uncertainty indefinitely by increasing the number of climate simulators because you don't know about the root of all evil. Right? Which is right. Similarly, there is a limit to what you can achieve by increasing the length of your climate simulator runs. And there is a limit to what you can achieve by increasing your simulator consensus, because there's something in there about the consensus, the covariance, the variability of the individual simulators from their overall mean, if you like. So all of that stuff is handled in the framework. It also tells us about how to weight climate simulators. Because if you look at this, this is a weighted average. The weights are matrix valued. And that means that the different sources of information here get different weights for different properties of the climate. And I think that's really, really important. So essentially what's going to happen is that the different information sources are going to be allowed, the simulators are going to be allowed to contribute to properties of the climate where they are informative, but they're going to be discounted where they're not informative. Okay? And that's, I think, much more satisfactory than the common approach of allocating weights to individual simulators. Now, as it stands at the moment, the simulators are all weighted equally, and that is a consequence of the fact that I have specified in my judgments for this simple case, in order that I could do the algebra, that they have the same internal variability and the same propensity to deviate from the overall mean. But that could be relaxed. Okay. I mean, I only started working on this last Thursday, so I haven't figured out how to invert the matrix when it gets a bit more complicated. But, so these weightings emerge naturally but indirectly from judgments about estimates of internal variability, consensus, and this. Okay. Which means that there's no need for sort of the arbitrary kind of heuristics that go on in the climate literature. Okay. And I think that's a really nice consequence of the framework. As the time is what it is, I'm not going to discuss, we can discuss that over coffee if you like. But so, if I can summarise the uncertainty framework, then I think it does handle most, if not all, of the major issues relating to multi-model ensembles. In particular, the weighting of simulators and observations are controlled by like buttons or dials in the front. There's a button or dial that will control everything you want to control, although they're not necessarily. I was quite surprised when I did the maths and discovered that there wasn't an explicit term in the result that was a comparison of simulator and observations. It emerges indirectly based on your judgments about these things. And I was sort of scratching my head and I thought, no, actually that's right. That is absolutely right. And so I've learned something by doing it anyway. And the framework rewards the strengths of climate simulators, and I think penalises is too strong. I think discounts weaknesses. Okay, so it allows the simulator. It allows you to take the best out of every climate simulator. By the way that the weights automatically adjust. Now, if we go back to Bryson's stakeholder, who is that guy?
Someone from the web.
Oh, right, okay. Well, he's still looking pretty much the same, but I think he might be, in terms of the Australian water resources, I think he's looking like that for a different reason now. Okay, so we've concluded that a near zero rainfall scenario is possible. You asked about my caveat. The results can be sensitive to the prior and emulator structure, and what that tells me is that the available GCM data that we've used are not sufficient to resolve differences in prior judgments. Okay, so maybe he's looking like that for a different reason. Okay, but I think we've told him something. I think I'll just leave that there. And, thank you for your attention. And if anybody's got any questions or comments.
I just like to say, I think it's just a really wonderful contribution. I think it's going to make a huge difference to the way that you think about the market model. The key thing that you've done, which is really neat, and as statisticians, it should always be at the forefront of our mind, is move the problem into the parameter space of the stochastic process, and then it makes it so much more plausible to work with tractable representations of uncertainty.
Yeah.
You could never do that if your features were actually rainfall.
No.
But to move rainfall into a finite dimensional, fixed dimensional parameter space and work with the parameters, I think is very, very neat. I'm not quite so sure about whether we can work in terms of anomalies on parameter space. Obviously, if we move parameters into the real space, that's a start, because then we can think of anomalies additively. But to me, that's, I think, still an open question about whether the anomaly approach works well.
Right. Okay.
But I think, as a general move, I think it's a stunning.
Thank you.
If I may pollute this talk with yet another practical, I want to say that you solved yet another practical issue, which is dealing with GCM modelers as stakeholders. Everyone, if you weight models in a multi-model ensemble, each center wants their model to be weighted more strongly. And in this sort of thing, you're simply weighting them all the same a priori and letting the results weight them themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And this solves a very bad political problem among the scientists themselves.
It does. Yes, I think. In principle, I think you're right. I think getting even more practical and thinking about how you might do it.
Yes.
There may be. It may not be entirely trivial to get it working if you threw everything, all the models that are available at this framework. I mean, I think you would probably want to take account of the fact that, for example, you've got 2 GFDL GCMs in the CMIP archive, for example. So you wouldn't want to say that, that they're more similar to each other than to other things.
There would be a partial exchangeability representation within your box.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think that could be done, but you'd need to think quite carefully. I mean, I think in principle, I agree with you, and thank you for recognising that. But it's not something that you could sit down and do today, and with all of the CMIP runs, I don't think. But yeah.
I also think that it's a great step. It's maybe overdue. Why did you choose time series and not, say, spatial patterns or other features?
Because I was working on this problem.
Okay. Yes, time series. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the engineering hydrologists and the water resource managers need time series structure, and of course the downscaling model produces spatial fields of precipitation, right? So I mean, what I'm trying to do is to sort of reduce this very complicated problem, as John D said, down to a small number of parameters.
So when you change the time series model itself, so you instead of considering NAR1, you consider NAR2 or something, how does that translate into the uncertainties?
Well, I mean, in principle, there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't take a Markov random field.
Yes.
Because all you're doing is you're saying you have a statistical emulator of whatever output you're interested in. So if those outputs are a multivariate time series, as I've got, that emulator is a multivariate time series model. If the outputs are a spatial field, okay, you use a Markov random field and that's got some parameters, and that's what you work with. So I think the specific nature of the emulator is not critical. That happens to be what we've done because that was what we were interested in.
Bryson, a very quick question. I know coffee time is good. So we're looking at the moment at North American anomalies. at the grid cell level, so that's at the UN grid cell, which is 3.75 degrees by 2.5 degrees. And our preliminary conclusion is there's no physics at the grid cell level. It's all noise. But, internal variability, which we weren't able to smooth out because we didn't have that. We couldn't do long enough integration. Which makes me a bit concerned about and we were talking about this with Peter Hoivers yesterday, about the whole downscaling process. I mean, if you're driving your original model with grid cell level information from a GCM, which is basically noise, then what do we expect to get out of that process? I mean, if the GCM is really only good at an aggregate of, say, 3 by 3 grid cells or 5 by 5 grid cells, what are we really getting from the downstream process?
Well, that's one of the problems you face, particularly with statistical models. It's basically garbage in, garbage out. I think the only thing I will say in defence of GCMs, I think that the sort of comments you're making are certainly true with coupled models. When you actually look at the historical runs with coupled models, even for something like Southwest WA, you don't see the rainfall decline. But if you use things like the prescribed SST fields and so on, so you start getting the boundary conditions right, and use that to drive an atmospheric GCM, particularly after dynamical downscaling, you can get at a regional scale, you can get the, you assume a linear trend, you can get that slope to 3 significant figures. So there is some skill in these models, but there's an increasing school of thought that seems to be pointing to either there's problems with the ocean circulation or the coupler. The couples all these different spheres together.
So we combined in our runs both dynamic oceans and slow oceans.
Right.
We didn't really find much difference actually, surprisingly, which is alarming and consoling in some ways. It's alarming because you would expect that partly in dynamic ocean ought to make a difference to and consoling because it meant we could use the same measure of internal variability for both.
Yeah, I think a motivation circulation model isn't a big gust, that sort of finding, but there's still one of the things, and I've talked to Richard about this numerous times, one of the things I always find is you're always battling against this reductionist, deterministic view of the world that as you add more complexity, you have to get more accuracy. And I think GCMs have certainly got better over the years and how well they simulate the current climate. It's still a long way to go. Particularly if you go down to the individual grid cell level, I don't think there's much information there. That's one of the reasons why with our predictors we try to use of the order of about 9 information from 9 cells and hope that you are capturing something sensible. I mean, with the reanalysis data, as I said earlier, it's observations used to drive an atmospheric GCM. You can fit the model to any part of the record and look at the wet epochs or the dry epochs out of Southwest WA. As I say, I think to me a lot of the problems seem to be with the ocean or the coupler or both.
Okay, shall we move caffeineward?
Yes.